Today's daf is daf Nun Tes, and we begin with the Mishnah that opens up the third parak, Parak HaOmer, on daf Nun Ches Amid Beis. And we begin with the subject of shlichus. HaOmer lechavero. And it's very interesting that the Mishnah used the word chavero as opposed to shlucho. Seva kadesh li isha plonis, v'holach v'kitcha liatzmo. There's a lot of literature about this in secular non-Jewish literature. He went ahead to shliach and he was mekadesh for himself. Mekudeshes lasheni. So what's the chiddush here? I mean, he said to her, "Arayat mekudeshes li." The shliach said that, and she accepted the Kiddushin. So Tosas says here, Dibra Maskala Omer, that the chiddush is that even if originally he spoke Diber Ima Shliach Shetiskadish Lamishaleach, the Shliach began the conversation by saying, "Hey, you'll be married to the Mishalech who sent me." And then he says, Arayat Mekudeshes Li. We're not going to say that when he said the word Li, he meant Lasos Shluchosi, and to Mekadesh her to the Mishalech. Unless she says, I want to be married to the Mishalech. But if she doesn't say that, she says, I want to be married to you, the Shliach, then the Kiddushin Achal, even though the Shliach initially opened up the discussion by saying that you should marry the Mishalech. V'chein, ha'omer li'ish arayat mekudeshes li lachar shloshim yom. The Kiddushin will only be chal after 30 days. So nothing really transpired in the meantime. After Ruvain said to Liachar Shloshim, Shimon came along, he's Mekadesher, she's Mekudeshes to Shimon. Because the Kiddushin to Ruvain would not take effect until after 30 days. And the Mishnah wants to emphasize that this Kiddushin to the Sheni is Vadai, it's not Kiddushin Safek, and therefore Bas Yisrael Lekoin Tocha B'Tru. Even though she's a Bas Yisrael, since the second Mekadesh, Toch Shloshim Yom, was a Kohen, she can eat Truma. She has the status of an Eishes Kohen, and the Kiddushin Sheni Achal Legamre. If, on the other hand, he said to her, Haret Mekudesh Li Me'achshav Lachar Shloshim Yom, now we get into the suffix situation, because he uses two Lashonos that almost contradict each other. On the one hand, he says Me'achshav, as the Kiddush should be chal now, which means that she's only married to the first guy who said Me'achshav and not to the second guy. But on the other hand, the first guy, Ruvain, said Me'achshav li'achar shloshim, which sounds like the Kiddushin will be developing, the Ishus will be chal in stages, day by day over the course of 30 days. She's in a state of a suffix. She might be married to the Rishon, to Ruvain. She might be married to the Sheni, that's Shimon. Therefore, if she wants to marry someone else, she'll need a get from both Ruvain and Shimon. If he wants to marry Ruvain, she'll need a get from Shimon. If she wants to be married to Shimon, she'll need a get from Ruvain. Bas Yisrael leKohen. So let's take this suffix and apply it to Truma. She's a Bas Yisrael, and one of these two Makadshim, we're not sure if she's Mekudeshes to Ruvain, the first one, or to Shimon, the second one. One of the two is a Kohen. She can't eat Truma. Oh, Bas Kohen li Yisrael. Even if she's a Bas Kohen, she's been eating Truma since the days that she was born, but now she might be married to a Kohen, because one of these two gentlemen is a Kohen. Is therefore lo tochal Truma miman of she can eat Truma, because she might be a Bas Yisrael who's married to a Kohen. She must be a Bas Kohen who's married to Yisrael. The Gemara says, "Omer chaver tzeva kadesh." Tana, we learned in a brisa in Masechet Yevamos Perek Dalet, me she'asa asui el shenagbo minig ramos. The comment that's added by the brisa seems to be a moral, ethical one. That is, that even though the Kiddushin, as the Mishnah formulates it, is chal vis-a-vis the Shliach, because he said Arei Mekudesh Li, nevertheless, the Shliach is called a Ramai. He was not loyal to his mission as a Shliach. He was sent as a proxy on behalf of the Mishalech, and he violated that agency and married her for himself. Now, you might have thought, says the Ritva, that once the Brisa goes as far as to call him a Ramai, that maybe they would consign him and they would as a punitive measure, they would prohibit him from being married to her. That far they don't go. But he is called a Ramai. Now, exactly what are the implications, or shall we say the ramifications of being classified as a Ramai? That I don't know. I would think that it's a message to the people that this kind of a sly person should not be trusted. Even the Tan of Mishnah alludes to the fact that he's a Ramai by adding the word halach, which is a redundant word. And what's the implication, the meaning of the word halach? Halach beramos. And even though we find in some contexts that the word halach could be halach for a good thing, but we also find that halach could be batzas rishoyim, and that's the first pasuk, David HaMelech's Tilim, Asher Isha Shalo halach batzas rishoyim. Gemara asks, Ma'ishna hacha the Ketani ha'omer lechavero. It doesn't say ha'omer lishlucho, as we pointed out when we learned the Mishnah. It says ha'omer lechavero. It sounds like he wasn't appointed as a full-fledged shliach. And now we begin our daf nun tes. U'ma'ishna hasom, whereas the Mishnah earlier on daf nun, the Ketani, it says ha'omer lishlucho, say v'kadish li'isha plonis b'mokom ploni, so why is it that here in our Mishnah it's Ha'omer L'Chavero, whereas the Mishnah back on Daf Nun is Ha'omer L'Shlucha? More answers. In each case, the Mishnah is telling me an extra chiddush. What's the chiddush of our Mishnah? If he had used the word Shlucha Avamina, I would have said that if he was appointed as a full-fledged shliach, and then he went ahead, violated his shlichus, and took her for a wife for himself, hu davi Ramai. That's where he's a Ramai. Why? The samcha daita, because the Mishalech completely relied and had trust and faith in the shliach that he would do his shlichus. Savar avad li shlichusa. I have no doubt that he's going to fulfill my shlichus. But I would think that if he only says lechavero, go out and be makadosh mi anisha. In other words, he wasn't actually appointed specifically to be or explicitly to be a shliach, but rather he said to him, you know what? If you happen to find yourself in proximity to this woman, then do me a favor, be makadosh of him. Lo samcha daita. He didn't assume up front that vadai this person would go ahead and be makadosh as a shliach. Is Emo lo alevi Ramai. I might think that he's not considered a Ramai, and therefore the Mishnah says no, even though he only said it in a general sense. Chavero, do me a favor, if you happen to chance upon this woman, be makadosh her on my behalf. He went ahead, he was makadosh for himself, he's a Ramai. Chasam, there in the Mishnah on Daf Nun of B'makom Ploni, Rabusa Kamashma, the Itari Omer Chavero Havamina Chavero Hu Dechi Kidsha Makom Acher Eina Mekudeshes. When the Shliach went to the wrong place, other than the place that was designated by the Mishalech, if it was Lechavero, then the Kiddushin is undermined and invalidated. Why does Savar Lo Torah? The Mishalech thought that this shliach is not going to go off in a far place. That's a tircha for him to go, all the way west to California, and therefore he didn't appoint him as a shliach to this particular place. Avol shlucho de Torah. But in a case where he appointed him specifically as a shliach up front, and therefore he was somech, the Mishalech was somech on the tircha of the shliach, that the shliach would go ahead and certainly track her down. even in a different place, I might think, Mara Makamula. Maybe when he said to the shliach, you'll find her here, he was just trying to save some of the energy necessary for the shliach to find her. They'll find her right here. So that's called Mara Makamulo. We had this before. And therefore, if it's only Mara Makamulo, even though the shliach went ahead and found her and it was Makadosh her at a different place, the Kiddushin would be valid. Kamash Malan. The Tana wants to tell us that the Lashon of Shlucho means that even with regard to the shliach, full-fledged, direct, explicit shliach, the din is the same, that he finds her in another place, and he's Makadosh her there in a different locale, Eina Mekudeshes. The Gemara tells us a number of stories, and they are relevant because they're very similar to what our Mishnah is dealing with. Ravin Chasida. Ravin was a Chassid, and he comments over here that another gear says Rav Amram Chassid. He went to be Mekadesh a specific woman on behalf of his son, and then V'kitchel Nafsha. He decided he wants to marry her for himself. So the Gemara says, you call that person a Chassid? Vasanya, Mashasa also, yes, the Shlichus b'di'evet is Chal, the Kiddushin is valid, but El Shanag bo Minigram Mobs. Are we saying that Rav Amram Chasida or Ravin Chasida was knowing a Minigram Mobs? The Gemara answers, Lo Yahavan Nile. They didn't have an agreement, a heskem, that this woman would be married off to his son. Now, he finds the father, meaning Ravin, finds this woman, and apparently she would be agreeable to marry his son. Now, it's true that Lo Yavanile, they never had a heskem that this woman would be married off to his son. But that doesn't mean that it's the right thing to be Makadosh to himself. He should have notified his son and explained why he's marrying her for himself. He should go out of his way to clear his reputation from any chashad of a minigramos. And the Gemara says that therefore Rav Amram or Ravin was not playing a fair game. How could he do such a thing? In other words, if she was agreeable to marry the son, let him notify the son, and then they'll work things out. And the Gemara answers Savar of Ravin, again, if it's Ravin Chassid, Adahachi dahachi, till he notifies the son, also Irish Achrina Makadishli. This is the famous principle, the Gemara in Moed Katan, that you're allowed to be Makadish and Ish on Chol Moed because Shema Yikad Menu Achim. So he was choshesh that he would lose her, and therefore Chayecha Kodmin L'Chayecha Vercha, he doesn't have to go back to notify the son that, I'm not doing this in a way of Ramos, I'm notifying you up front that I'm going to go ahead and marry this woman. And he doesn't have to notify the son if it entails a certain element of risk that he might lose the possibility of having that shidduch. Because also in Shachrina Makadish. Another story. Rabba bar Chana Yoev leZuze leRav. Rabba gave money to Rav, Omar, and he said to Rav, Zavna Niale Lahai Ara, purchase on my behalf a certain piece of karka. Azil and Zavna L'Nafshe. Rav went ahead and he purchased the land for himself. Could it be that Rav was Noeg Chas V'Shalom a minigramos? Gemara answers that karka was a baga dalima havile. Baga means a valley. And those who lived in that valley were alime. Alime means very tough mafiosos. They would not allow just anyone to buy karka in their gegen, in their area. But Larav Nogibay covered these bulvians, these balizroa, as we call them in Hebrew, were noeg kavod. They had a tremendous reverence for Rav. But Larav Baruch Hana lo Nogibay covered. They weren't interested in giving reverence and respect to Rabbi Baruch Hana. And therefore, they never would have allowed this mecher to go by if they knew that the purchaser of the land was Rav Baruch Hana. The only possibility of purchasing the land was if Rav, for whom they had respect and reverence, would buy the land. That's not Ramos. Once again, Rav should have cleared his reputation by notifying Rav Baruch Hana that he was now going to purchase the land for himself because there's no other option. And instead, by not notifying Rabbah, it looks like minig Ramos. It looks to the outside. In fact, that's exactly why the Gemara raised this question. And the Gemara answers, it's not necessary to risk the possibility that you'll lose the deal for the sake of clearing your reputation and making sure that no one should suspect you of Ramos. You're permitted to enter into that possibility of being choshen Ramos for the sake of clinching the deal, because if you wait too long, forget it. A good piece of real estate could go overnight. It's sold. So in the case of Hefsed, a person does not have to be motzias atzma michashad Ramos. Another story. Rav Gida was trying to buy a certain piece of karka. Ozil Rabbi Abba Zavna. Rabbi Abba grabbed it away and bought it for himself. Ozil Rav Gida Kabli. Rav Gidel starts complaining. He registers his complaint in front of Rabbi Abba. Against Rabbi Abba to Rabbi Zera. Azil Rabbi Zera v'Kabli. The Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Rabbi Zera went ahead and he transmitted the taina of Rav Gidel to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, as Rashi points out, is the Rebbe of Rabbi Abba. So by going to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha, there's a possibility that Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha would admonish his Talmud, Rabbi Abba, for going ahead and purchasing the land. Amalei. So Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha tells Rabbi Zera, Hamten Achiyale Etzlenu L'Regel. Rabbi Abba on the regel was Makabel Pnei Rabbo. He would come to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha to be Makabel Ponim. And that's a mitzvah in the Gemara Shoshana Tezayinu and Beis, Chayav Odom Lahakbil Pnei Rabbo B'Regel. Kisolik. Rabbi Abba came up for the regel. Ashkeche. He encounters Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Amalei, Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha says to Rabbi Abba, you judge for yourself. How would you consider a person who's an ani and he has an opportunity to be zochem in a hefker, or he has a balabas who owns the charora, this food, this uga, and this balabais would give it to him, and the ani is in need for that uga, for that charora, and now somebody else comes and grabs it away. How would you classify such a person? Amalei Nikra Russia. This is what we call in Talmudic language Yored L'chai Chavera. Ani Amahapich B'Charora. Velamar, my time of it off. Hey, you just condemned yourself, Rabbi Abba, because you just judged what you did yourself as rishus. After all, Rav Gidel was trying to purchase the land and you grabbed it away and purchased it for yourself. That's called Ani Amapik B'Charora, and he's Nikra Rosha. Amalei Rabbi Abba defends himself. Lo Avi Yadana. I was totally unaware of the fact that Rabbi Gidel was trying to buy this land. I saw the for sale sign and I decided it's a good deal. I want to buy the land. Says Rav Yitzchak Nafka, Hashta Nami, Nesva Nil Amar. You know what? Now you should give the karka over to Rav Gidel. I mean, he'll pay you, reimburse you for every last nickel that you bought. I don't want to give it up and sell it to Rabbi Gidel. The Arakamaisi. This is the very first time in my life that I purchased a piece of real estate. Velo misamna milsa. It's not a good omen, a good siman yafet, to sell the very first thing that you bought. If Rav Gidel wants to receive it as a gift, I'll give it to him as a gift from the goodness of my heart. But I'm not going to sell it to him, because if you sell something that you bought and it was the first purchase in your life, that's not a siman yof. And the Gemara concludes, Rav Gidel lo nachasle. Even though Rabbi Abba was willing to give him the karka as a gift, Rav Gidel doesn't want any gifts because the Chsiv of Pasuk Mishlei Tezvav, the Sone Matanos Yich. What about Rabbi Abba? If Rav Gidel is not going down to the karka and enjoying and exploiting it, then why doesn't Rabbi Abba, who paid full price for the karka, go down? Lo nachasle. He knew that Rav Gidel was Mahapeh B'Charora, and Rav Gidel was very eager to purchase the land. He, Rabbi Abba, unknowingly had violated the principle of Ani Mahapeh B'Charora, and therefore he didn't want to enjoy any benefit from the land. Is lo marnoch is lo, v'lo marnoch is lo. Neither did Rav Gidel go down to the karka nor Rabbi Abba. Umiskaria, and it got a name. The karka got a reputation of Ara D'Rabban. This is karka that belongs to the Chacham. Now, what's the implication of calling this karka Ara D'Rabban? So if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says Hefker leTalmidim, which means that the karka belongs in a general sense to all the chachamim and their students. And this is called Ara D'Rabbanan as a Zecher Tov L'Chasidusam. And since it was Hefker for Talmidim, L'chein Yachlu HaTalmidim L'shtamish Ba, and they could enjoy the benefit of it. However, it's not really hefker, but kevad sheshneim lo yardu litocha, the amda below shimush hayatalmidim rashoyim lishtamish ba bechinam kidin sada she'eno meres lahaskara, and that's the sugya of midas stone in Bava Kama Daf Chaf. Now, if a man lends money to a woman and then he wants to mekadosh with that money, we had a sugya back on Daf Mevav, Eina Mekudeshes, because Milva lo tzon, she already has the money and he's not giving her anything new. But if a person is mafkid mos biada isha, she's only a shomer or a nifkedes, and therefore the money was deposited in her possession. Now he wants to mekadosh with that money. If she still has at least a Shava Pruta's worth of the original mos, then the Kiddushin is valid. Because there's no mos lo tzonit, no, with regard to a pikada. So he's giving us something new for Kiddushin. The Mishnah says, "V'chein ha'omer li'ishes kadshi li'achar shloshim yom ba'achar v'kitsh v'sol shloshim yom v'kudesh l'sheni." So the Gemara says, Loba v'kitsha b'tok shloshim. When a man says to a woman, Hare at mekudesh li liachar shloshim, and no one else comes and jumps and tries to mekadesh her, what's the din? He had given her money, but the Kiddushin wouldn't be chal until the end of 30 days. Is Rav Shmuel, the Amitrav Vayu Mekudeshes. At the end of the 30 days, she'll be Mekudeshes. Why? Because she received at the beginning of the 30 days Kesef Kiddushin. So the Gemara adds, V'afal pi shenis aklu amos. But the mos don't exist anymore. What would generate the Ishus, the Kiddushin, and validate it at the end of the 30 days when there's no mos? My timer. Hani zuze. Lola milvadam. This is not to be equated with milva. The money was not given to her at the beginning of the month as a milva to which we would apply the principle of milva lo tzadin. No. But rather lipikadodam. He was saying to her, these mos are deposited in your possession, and if at the end of the 30-day period you would be left with a shava pruta, then I'll be makadosh you with the shava pruta. There was no din of lo tzadin with regard to any of the mos that she received at the beginning of the 30 days, and he was makadosh liachar lamed. If, on the other hand, all the money was gone, there's not even a shava pruta left in the original money, then she's not mekudeshes. And the Gemara explains. The status of these mos during that 30-day period is a very complex status. It's certainly not a milva because he's not lending her any money. He's giving her the money for Kiddushin. On the other hand, it's not exactly a pikado, because a pikado means don't touch the money. I'm just leaving it in your possession, and you'll return it as is at the end of the 30 days. So the Gemara says, "L'pikadon lo dami, pikadon b'shus demari kamis akle." The Makadesh, who's also called Mora means the Bailim, he has possession over the mos in a case of pikadon. And if the pikadon is lost, then he suffers that loss. So since at the moment that he was makadosh her, which means at the end of the 30 days, there's not even a pruta left in the world, and a mekudeshes. But vahani, but these mos that were given to her for the purpose of being mekudeshes at the end of 30 days, b'shusa di daka misalka. It's not considered as if the mos are in his rishus, as it is in a classic pikadon, where the mos are considered to be in the rishus of the mafkid, but rather no. Here it's considered to be in the rishus of the nifkad, meaning the isha, because he gave it to her for the purpose of Kiddushin. And now, since at the time of the Kiddushin she received a pruta, and the pruta is still extant, she's mekudeshes. Lemilva nami lo dam. But a person's mekadesh in this kind of a way of liachar shloshim, it's not similar to a milva, because milva lo tzadin. He gave it to her for kesef Kiddushin on the condition that the Kiddushin will be chal at the end of 30 days. So it's not alva for 30 days. He didn't give her the green light to go ahead and use these mos and spend them in any way she wants to. But rather, he gave it to her for Kiddushin, not as a milva. In a case of a milva, he has rights to get it back, to be paid back, to be reimbursed for the money that was borrowed. But in this case that he gave it to her for sure, for Kiddushin, he was mafkia all schus. He removed and undermined from himself any schus that he has in these mos. And if that be the case, then how could he be Makadisha with these mos? Hani b'toras Kiddushin yahivnala Neil. These monies were given to her from the beginning, from the get-go, only on the condition that she would be married through these mos. And therefore, if she used these mos that have a Torah's mos Kiddushin, Kesef Kiddushin, then even though now they don't exist in the world, the Kiddush should be Chal. Because from the get-go, at the beginning of the 30 days, it was given to her to be Miskadish by him. And therefore, she received Kesef Kiddushin, which if she uses, she's using her own Kesef Kiddushin. And it seems to me that the Gemara now is emphasizing the Maisa Kiddushin. Since there was a Maisa Kiddushin, she now receives those mos as Kesef Kiddushin, and therefore they are transferred over to Rishus, and she could use them as if they were hers, and even if now they don't exist, the Kiddushin is Chal by virtue of the fact that she received the Kesef Kiddushin. But the status of the Kiddushin during the period of 30 days is a little bit unclear. The Gemara vacillates about this. Lo ba acher v'kidsha uchazru b'mao. If no one else was Makadisha during these 30 days when he was Makadisha li'achar lamed, would the Kiddushin be Chal if she was Chozer ba? She now decides before day 30, she doesn't want the Kiddushin. And we understand Rabbi Yochanan. That's naturally intuitive. Rabbi Yochanan Mechozeres. The Kiddushin are not going to take place. They're not going to be Chal until the end of the 30 days. In the meantime, in the interim, she could be Chozeres. The Asi Dibur Mavato Dibur, even though she initially, at the beginning of the 30 days, when she received the money, she agreed to be married to, but now, Asi Dibur Mavato Dibur, she now rejects the original commitment to get married, she rescinds it, and her second last Dibur of Zavato, the first Dibur. Reish Lakish Amreina Chozeres, the Lo Asi Dibur Umavatel Dibur. There is no inherent power of the second dibur to cancel, negate, and undermine the first dibur. So since initially she accepted the Kiddushin as such, she can't be Chozeres. She can't be Mevatel, the original dibur. Esvei, so the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, how could this be? The Mishnah in the third parak of Trumas, in a case where Balabais appoints a shliach to be mafresh truma from his payrolls, ubitel, and the Balabais later on was mavatel shlichos. What's the din? So the Mishnah in Trumas established it depends. Im ad shalot taram bitel is then ein trumaso truma. If before the shliach actually was mafresh the truma, the balabayas was mevatel the shlichus, then the shlichus is betela, but and ain't trumos a truma. But if the shliach went ahead and implemented the shlichus, then the balabayas can no longer be mevatel the shlichus. It's too late. In fact, the Gemara of Hacha, this is Rabbi Yochanan's objection to Reish Lakish. Did dibur v'kasi dibur mevatel dibur? We have a dibur of bittul shlichus, and pit that up against the dibur of minui shlichus, and the dibur of bittul shlichus now trumps the dibur of minui shlichus. And we see that the underlying principle of the Mishnah in the third parak of Trumas is that asi dibur mevatel dibur, and therefore she could be chozeres, but in the case of Kiddushin liachar lamed. And that's a kash on Reish Lakish. Says the Gemara name, Reish Lakish concedes that there is a koch in dibur to be mevatel a dibur. Why? Because you have one dibur against another, and Reish Lakish agrees that the second dibur is mevatel the first dibur. But what if there was not only a dibur, there was also a maisa? Shiny nesinas mostly out of isha. In this case, he gave the most to the isha. And he did a maisa kiddushin. Dichi maisa dami islo asi dibur mevatel dibur. Even Reish Lakish will agree in this case that lo asi dibur mevatel dibur. Why? Lo asi dibur mevatel dibur, according to Reish Lakish, means that dibur cannot be mevatel dibur unless there's a real maisa. But here, there is a real maisa. He gave her Kiddushin. And even though he said liachar lamed, which means that the maisa is really not a maisa gomor, but nevertheless it's a maisa, it has a Torah's maisa. And therefore the principle is lo asi dibur mevatel maisa. I'm trying to figure out what Rabbi Yochanan would say. Rabbi Yochanan is saying what? Is Asi Dibur Mavatal Dibur. Because Rabbi Yochanan is going to argue that the original Areh Mekudeshesli, which he accepted, is not really a Dibur because he said Liachar Lam. And since he said Liachar Lamed, the entire process is in suspended air. Esvei, once again, Rabbi Yochanan raised an objection to Reish Lakish, this time from the Mishnah in Git Lamed Beis. Hashalech get liishto. A man sends a shliach with a get. Vigia b'shliach, and the Baal runs after the shliach. And he says to the shliach, I don't want this shlichus to be chal. O shesholach achrav shliach, or the Baal sent the shliach to track down the shliach. V'yomer lo. And the shliach Rishon was told the following: "Get shenasati chabotel. I gave you a get into your hands, but it's bottle. Haray's a bottle." Now, what's going on over here? For nesinas get liyad shliach dechi nesinas mol yad isha dami. There's no difference, says the Gemara, between giving the get over to the hands of the shliach and giving the most of Kiddushin into the hands of the isha. And in both cases, there was a Maisa Nesina. And there wasn't yet a Chalos Kiddushin or a Chalos Gerushin. And nevertheless, Ketani Areza Bata. That there's a Koch in Dibur to be Mevatel another Dibur, even though that original Dibur had a Maisa to it. And that's what the Gemara says here. It postulates that Nesinas Haget Liad Shliach is also called a Maisa, just like Nesinas Mos Liad Isha. And the Gemara answers, Hasan Navi, even in the case of Shlichus L'Gerushin, Kal Kama Delomata Gita Liyada, as long as the get has not reached the Yada Isha, the Maisa Gerushin hasn't even begun. And the Nesinil Shliach is not considered even a Maisa Kata. And therefore we end up with Dibur v'Diburhu and Osi Dibur v'Vatel Dibur. In the case of Kiddushin, is Liachar Kiddushin Lachar Shloshim, there's a Maisa Kata, and the Nesina L'Isha is the Nesina that's going to generate Kiddushin. He doesn't need another Maisa Nesina. You just have to wait till 30 days pass, and therefore, Ein Dibra Isha Mavatel Mais. Now the Gemara goes on to Masechet Chulin on Daf Chaf Hey in the laws of Tumah V'Tara, which means that if you have a raw material that's going to be made into a Kli, that Kli is only Makabel Tumah when Nigmar Malachton, when the creation of the Kli was complete. meaning that the Bailam intend to use it as is. If on the other hand the Bailam wants to add to it, to beautify it, to make it better l'takno, then even though the kli at this point is roy l'shimush, it's usable, nevertheless, it's not makabel tum. Esvei. Reish Lakish now is on the offensive. L'Rab Yochanan. Kol ha'kelim yordim lidei tumasam b'machshava. If you were producing and manufacturing a kli, the machshava alone is enough to generate a shem kli, and it's makabel tuma. If the balabayas is happy with this early stage in the tikkun hakli and the yipui hakli, it's enough that he has machshava, and if that machshava generates a shem kli gamur, it's roy l'shimush, and therefore it's makabel tuma. The ein olim midei tumasam el b'shini ma'is. Once there was a chal shem kli, and therefore it's makabel tuma. To be mavatal l'shem kli, you can only do so through a shinui ma'isa. That the bala bayis has to do a ma'isa befall in the kli. For example, let's say they began to produce, manufacture, and beautify this kli. If the balabayas chashav b'libo, he thinks in his heart that he wants to improve it, then ein bittul shem kli, and that's what's called shini ma'isa. Unless it's a shini ma'isa, machshava alone is not enough to be mavato the shem kli. Or, for example, let's say the kli was already makabel tuma, and you want to be metayer the kli from its tuma through machshava bilvad, that the balabais wants to be mavato the Torah's kli. And it doesn't become Torah. Why? Because it was already makabel tuma before his machshava. So that's the first part of the Mishnah in Masechet Kelim.